On the evening of December 29, 1978, families across southern Poland were making plans for New Year's Eve. The temperature outside was a comfortable plus 10 degrees Celsius. Children were running in the streets without heavy coats. In Warsaw, people were picking out their outfits for the celebrations ahead. In the southern city of Krakow, a woman was hanging laundry to dry on her balcony. Everything felt normal. Everything felt fine. 48 hours later, that same woman was melting snow on her stove for drinking water because the pipes in her building had burst and frozen solid. The laundry on her balcony had become a sheet of ice. The temperature outside had dropped 35 degrees in 2 days, and across an entire country, everything that was supposed to work had simply stopped. This is the story of Zima Stulecia, the winter of the century. And if you think you know what a bad winter looks like, stay with me, because what happened to Poland in those weeks is something most people today can barely imagine. The meteorological reason behind Zima Stulecia was almost elegant in how ruthless it was. A massive high-pressure system sitting over Scandinavia collided with a low-pressure system drifting over southern Poland. The difference in pressure between the two systems was enormous. Winds of 60 to 70 kilometers per hour tore across the country from the west, picking up moisture over the Baltic Sea and depositing it inland as ferocious continuous snow. At the same time, Arctic air from the north came flooding down behind the wind front, dropping temperatures at a speed that Poland's infrastructure had no capacity to handle. On December 29th, the north of Poland was already gripped in minus 20-degree cold. The south was still enjoying early spring temperatures. By December 31st, New Year's Eve, the entire country had been swallowed. There was no gradual transition, no gentle warning. The cold moved like a wall, and the wall hit everything at once. Poles who lived through that night remember a particular sound. Not howling wind, not the crack of frozen pipes, though there was plenty of both. They remember the silence that came after, a heavy, complete, suffocating silence that snow creates when it falls fast enough and deep enough to absorb every sound the world normally makes. Cities of hundreds of thousands of people went quiet in a single night, and in that quiet, the crisis was just beginning. Here is what makes Zima Stulecia different from an ordinary bad winter. It was not just the cold. It was the simultaneous failure of every single system that a modern society depends on, all at once, in a country that was already struggling. The trains stopped first. Poland's rail network was the circulatory system of the communist economy. Coal traveled by rail, food traveled by rail, people traveled by rail. When temperatures dropped to minus 25 and below, the metal rails contracted and buckled. Switches froze solid. The overhead electrical lines that powered the trains snapped under the weight of ice, accumulating faster than any crew could clear it. Snowdrifts in some areas of northern Poland reached 3.5 meters in height, burying entire sections of track so deeply that you could walk across them and not know a rail line was underneath your feet. Within the first 48 hours, over 18,000 kilometers of road had been buried. Trains simply stopped where they were and stayed there. The power grid followed. The demand for electricity in a country suddenly trying to heat itself in minus 25-degree cold was enormous. The communist-era grid was not built for it. Rolling blackouts began on New Year's Eve. Thousands of Polish families spent the first hours of 1979 in candlelight, in temperatures that were dropping by the hour, with no radio to tell them what was happening or how long it would last. The gas pressure in pipes dropped so low that kitchen burners barely flickered. People could not cook. They could not heat water. They could not get warm. Think about what New Year's Eve normally means. The food, the warmth, the music, the sense that one year is ending and another is opening in front of you with all its promise still intact. In Poland on December 31st, 1978, families sat in their coats inside their own apartments. The heating radiators had gone cold because the central heating system, which depended on fuel deliveries that were no longer arriving, had shut down in building after building across the country. Indoor temperatures in many Warsaw apartment blocks fell below 10 degrees. People layered on everything they owned. Grandparents sat closest to whatever heat source remained. Children slept in the same bed as their parents and their grandparents. 3 generations pressed together in the dark, waiting for a morning that might or might not be warmer. The street celebrations that were supposed to happen did not. The roads were impassable. The trams had stopped running. In the villages, the situation was worse. Rural Poland was simply cut off. Drifts covered roads to the height of a standing man. There were villages where nobody left and nobody entered for a full week. The people inside those villages had whatever they had in their cellars and whatever was in their cupboards and nothing more. They managed it the way Polish village communities had always managed impossible things, by dividing what existed and helping each other use it as slowly as possible. Edward Gierek had been running Poland since 1970 on a philosophy of modernization and borrowed money. He had taken loans from Western banks to build factories, to improve infrastructure, to give Polish citizens a slightly better standard of living than the grey poverty of the Stalin years. The deal he offered the country was simple: trust the party, work hard, and the economy will improve. By 1978, that deal was already fraying badly. The debts were mounting, the shelves were getting thinner, the promises were getting harder to believe, and then the winter arrived, and the entire performance collapsed. The government's first response was to say very little. No emergency broadcast went out on the night of December 31st, explaining what was happening. No official speech acknowledged the scale of what Polish families were about to face. The regime that demanded credit for every factory built and every harvest collected went silent when the crisis hit, because the crisis exposed something the regime could not afford to admit: that the infrastructure it had spent a decade boasting about could not survive a single week of serious winter. Eventually the military was deployed. Tanks, actual combat tanks, were sent out to clear roads because no civilian snow-clearing equipment existed in sufficient quantity or remained operational in temperatures that froze hydraulic systems solid. Soldiers with shovels worked alongside citizens who had simply come out of their buildings and started digging, because there was nothing else to do. This image of an army deployed against snow because no other solution was available became one of the defining images of the entire Gierek era. The state had tanks. It did not have snowplows. The priorities were obvious and everyone could see them. Amid everything else that was happening, February brought a tragedy that is still remembered separately from the winter itself. On February 15, 1979, a gas explosion tore through the Rotunda building in Warsaw, a circular PKO bank building in the center of the city. 49 people died, 135 were injured. The winter made it worse in a specific and terrible way. The thick layer of snow covering the building had trapped leaking gas underneath, instead of allowing it to disperse into the air. The extreme cold had caused the chemical added to gas to alert people to leaks to condense and lose its smell. Nobody could detect what was accumulating beneath the snow. When the explosion came, it came without warning. In any other winter, the gas would have escaped, and the disaster would not have happened. Zima Stulecia did not just freeze the country. In that building on that February afternoon, it killed people who had no idea they were in danger. The government eventually cleared the roads. The trains eventually ran again. The power came back, stopped, came back again. But during the weeks when none of those things were functioning, the people who survived did so through the same network of informal human connection that Poland had always depended on when the official system failed. Neighbors shared coal. Families with more firewood than they needed passed it to families who had none. Men in villages formed clearing teams every single morning, working through snowdrifts for hours before any official equipment arrived, simply so the path between houses remained passable. Farmers who still had horses brought food on sleds to elderly residents who had not been able to leave their homes in days. In cities, building caretakers became the most important people in any apartment block, managing what heat remained, organizing whatever supplies could be gathered, keeping track of which residents were in danger of freezing and needed to be brought somewhere warmer. The black market, that constant shadow economy that communist Poland had been running alongside its official one for decades, moved food and fuel in directions the state distribution system no longer could. A man who knew a truck driver knew when a delivery was coming and where it was going. A woman who worked in a food warehouse knew what had arrived that the shops had not yet been told about. The system the government had built to feed and heat the country had seized up like a frozen engine. So the people built a different system out of whatever they had in reach, and they ran it on trust and necessity, and the deep Polish instinct to keep the person standing next to you alive. By mid-March 1979, the rivers began to crack. The ice moved. The temperatures climbed back towards something that felt like the real world. The country came out of it, blinking in the thin early spring light, and began to count the damage. The economic consequences were severe. Factories that had stopped production during the crisis had missed targets that the communist system tracked obsessively. Deliveries that had not arrived had left gaps in supply chains that took months to repair. The already fragile financial position that Gierek had been managing through foreign debt became noticeably worse. Historians who have traced the arc of communist Poland's collapse often point to the winter of 1978 to 1979 as one of the moments when the end became visible. Not immediately, not to everyone, but in the spreadsheets and the empty shelves and the faces of the people who had spent 2 months being failed by everything the state had promised them. Gierek himself fell from power in 1980, replaced in the chaos of the solidarity strikes that erupted that summer. The winter had not caused those strikes, But it had shown every Polish worker exactly what the government's promises were worth when the temperature dropped, and the trains stopped, and the lights went out, and the tanks came to clear the snow. Zima Stulecia did not break Poland, but it showed the country, with perfect and unambiguous clarity, exactly what it was dealing with, and the people who lived through it never quite looked at the state the same way again.